I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I'm Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitre College, Delhi University. Today's lecture is part of the ongoing series on the English poetry, and the lecture is titled Robert Frost, the 20th Century Poet. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you would have heard about Robert Frost because his poems we are acquainted with them even at the level of our school, because so you see this is that poet which is studied even at the high school level, and of course by further senior levels at other senior levels as well. So you see, Robert Frost was actually born in 1874 and was around till 1963. So he's a 20th century American poet who's also known as a New England poet. And he also lived, a life that had a checkered course. Now you see, why do we call him a New England poet? Because you see, New England is a place in America, and he spent a considerable amount of time over there. Even as he had spent, a very, a major part of his life in San Francisco, that's in California. I would say, in fact, he was born there. But then he eventually moved along with his family to New England. And so when he was actually writing poems, that is where he was, based. But we say that, he lived a life that had a checkered course. Why is that? Now, you see, Frost had lost his father at the early age of 11. And after that, of course, he had the responsibility of, taking care of the family, along with, of course, his mother as well. So, you see, he tried various employment options to earn a living. He tried newspaper reporting, teaching at school, and even working at a mill. So, you see, in this phase of life, writing poetry for him was a leisurely pastime. It was a way for him to unwind or, to connect with himself when he was not taking care of the other responsibilities. But you see, it was around 1900 particularly that his bad health raised a possible concern for tuberculosis, right? And that's where he had moved to live on a farm in New Hampshire. Now, we all understand that, tuberculosis is to do with the breathing issue. So he decided, therefore, to, live in the countryside on a farm that would help his condition. So you see, around 1906, with a still worsening health, Frost engaged in composing verses with even more eagerness. Now, of course, he was by himself living on a farm. Now, that kind of an environment also had an impact on his imagination, on his creativity. So we see that it was in 1906 that he actually started writing a lot of verses. So 1906, which means what? That it is the early 20th century that Robert Frost actually, starts writing. And then, if you look at his compositions, his first poetry collection was titled A Boy's Will, and it was published in 1913, which means in the second decade of the 20th century. Thereafter, his other poetry collection titled North of Boston was published in 1914. And after his brief stay in England, he moved to Vermont in the US in 1919, and he also bought a farm there, right, which we just now mentioned. So since then, we see that he kept frequenting between the rural settlements and city dwellings. Now, you might wonder that why is it important for us to know these details about his life? Now, you see, as we all are aware, that in Robert Frost's poems, nature plays a very important part. A lot of us notice, that how his poems are replete with references to nature, different elements from nature, and one may say that, this phase of life perhaps, has a contribution to making his poetry what it was. Now, you see, as we always, discuss that whenever a poet or a writer writes, they're never writing in a vacuum, right? Conditions around them, be it the social conditions, political conditions, or at times even, their own predicament or their own situation in life, does find a reflection in their compositions. So one can say then that, Robert Frost's exposure to the countryside or to the US countryside then played an important part in shaping the element of nature that we notice in his poems, right? Now we say that, this connection with the countryside, that he lived on a farm, explains his preoccupation with nature in his poetry, right? Now you see, we also understand that up until 1930s, Robert Frost was not very well known as a poet. It is only 1930 onwards that acknowledgement actually came his way. Now, you see, when we get to know these details, I'm sure that, it. I would say that in a way it also humanizes these literary figures who we really look up to. Sometimes, because now, of course, when we look back, Robert Frost is a very, very seminal name in American poetry. But if we go closer to their life details, we understand that how they have also had their share of influences, their share of ups and downs in life. So I say that, when we get to know about these details, it also not only takes us closer to the poets or the writers' influences, but it also in a way helps us understand what would have shaped their sensibilities as well, right? So then we say that, Robert Frost also, fame came to him very late, or let's say recognition. Fame is not the right word, but recognition came somewhat late to him, even though he started writing in 1901, but it's only in 1930 onwards that acknowledgement came his way. And then, of course, after that, there was no looking back for him. In 1957, he received honorary degrees from two top universities in the UK, that is Oxford and Cambridge, right? And honorary degrees, they are conferred upon people for their exemplary contribution in a given field. So, of course, Robert Frost was, I would say, conferred this degree for his contribution as a poet. And another feat that is, to his credit is that he became the poet to have won the Pulitzer Prize 4 times. Now, you see, we know that, all these very famous recognitions across the world, a lot of writers, poets received them. But Robert Frost got the Pulitzer 4 times. Now, you see, I'm sure that when we get to know these details, it really intrigues us to understand that what kind of poetry exactly was he writing that attracted so much of attention, right? So, if you now see on your screens, this is what, Robert Frost looked like. He's a man with stately, posture. He's tall, and of course, his writing was as impressive as his demeanor, his demeanor as well. Now, today, we are going to talk about this very important poem by Robert Frost that is called A Boundless Moment. Now, you see, Frost wrote numerous poems. He has to his credit multiple, collections of poetry. But of course, each, one common aspect connecting all of those poems is his reflections in nature. Now, you see, while we do understand that how nature becomes an important entity in his poems, it's also crucial for us to understand how do we see nature represented in his poems? what is it that he's doing with nature, right? Is he merely, creating pictures or scenes from nature, or is he doing something more? So, answers to these questions, I would say, somewhat also lie in this poem that is called A Boundless Moment. Now, you see, this is a poem from Frost's 1923 poetry collection that was called New Hampshire, which also won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, you see, New Hampshire, as a lot of you would be aware, is the name of a place in the US, right? And we just a while ago discussed that how he had bought a farm in New Hampshire, and he spent a lot of time over there amidst nature. So one can say that his time spent in this setting, which is away from the city, away from the the I would say the busy life of the urban areas, that he composes the set of poems that we find in New Hampshire. And one of those poems is A Boundless Moment. Now you see, one thing that you all must notice is also, of course, the time of the poem or the poetry collection. Now, it was written in 1923. Now, if you notice the year, automatically what comes to mind is, you see, the year situates the publication of the poem then very close at heels of the First World War. Now, the First World War had just concluded in 1918, right? We all know that the dates of First World War or it spanned from 1914 to 1918. And very soon after, Robert Frost was writing A Boundless Moment. Now, we have to understand that, as I mentioned just a while ago, that the social and the political conditions then have an important influence on the kind of work that a poet or a writer produces. So one can say that the First World War, and the conditions that were a result of that massive war can be seen as reflections in Robert Frost's poems as well, because you see, they cannot remain immune to the impact of such a significant historical moment, right? Now, the foremost thing that we all are aware about the First World War is that it was marked by widespread destruction and a complete breakdown of all that had defined people's lives until then. The values, beliefs, associations, and ideas, right? Everything that had come to define a people, it was called into question. Why? Because the scale or the extent of destruction was such that it seemed that nothing seemed to make sense anymore. Now, that's why we say that, all that had previously given meaning to the world was called into question. Now, this was the world handed over to the common people and also to the artists alike. So, a world that was broken, where there was a lot of uncertainty, there was doubt, there was instability, people were unsure what future holds for them. There was a lot of sadness, a lot of despair over the widespread destruction that they witnessed, and that too irrational violence, which connected all of this, right? So this was the kind of world that was handed over to the people and the artists alike. Now, with this little reference of what exactly was happening at the time when Robert Frost wrote this poem, let's take an overview of what actually happens in the poem before we go into a detailed stanza-wise analysis of it. Okay. Now, the first thing that we say is that A boundless moment captures two individuals traveling who happen to pass through a forest, right? Now, at the center then of the poem is the voice of the two travelers, right? And their observations when they are traveling and they pass through a forest. Now, they come across a mysterious sight which is far off in the distance, and one of them tries to comprehend it. They try to understand what is it that they see in the distance, right? But then the traveler's guess is as good as the second traveler's or his fellow travelers' understanding of what is it that they see in the distance, right? It's I would say, a vision that is full of mystery, right? And the poem we see that is written in the voice of the second traveler, who visits that moment in the poem and talks about it. So the second traveler is revisiting. He is thinking what had happened at the time when both of them were passing through forest, and they saw something that was mysterious, that was something strange, and that moment is then revisited, or one can also say recreated, by the second traveler in this particular poem, right? Now, the second thing that we say broadly about the poem is that there is an attempt to interpret that vision, and it highlights the individual's state of mind. And what lies ahead is not a clearly defined figure. So, we see here then that the emphasis is on the attempt or the effort in order to interpret or understand what is ahead of them. Again, you can directly connect it to what we just now discussed, the times when this poem was written. Now, the world hadn't still recovered from the massive war. They were clueless about the reasons, about the rationale, about about so many things, about so many questions that plagued people's minds. So perhaps one can say that this this element in the poem, whereby the travelers are looking at something in the distance which is mysterious, which does not make sense to them, and they are attempting to interpret it. All these elements then seem to capture the mood of the times, right? A third thing that we say about this poem is that there is a meditation on nature. What do we mean by meditation on nature? That nature becomes an important reference in this poem. The travelers or the poetic voice thinks about different elements of nature. They are in the middle of nature, and how does it impact their thought, their feeling? We see that in this poem, right? So you see, in this case, we notice that the travelers are in the woods or in the middle of a forest, and the reference to nature and the woods or the forest, it coalesces or combines with the individual's philosophical rumination, or what we call as the internal dialogue. Now you see, this is a very important point that we need to understand in this poem, and it also kind of starts to answer a question that we had raised in the beginning, that to what end is Robert Frost using or kind of evoking references to nature? What role does nature play in Frost's poetry? Why does he engage with nature so extensively? Now, of course, partial answers we got by looking at the life conditions that Frost underwent. But still more importantly, what we see is that in his poems, he at times uses nature in order to think about a philosophical aspect of humanity as well. So that's why we say that, the speaker in the poem and his or her and his philosophical rumination, right? The individual's philosophical rumination comes together with ruminations or references to nature. So, nature and the philosophical thinking human being comes together. In fact, what we can say is that nature becomes the source for such philosophical thoughts which are expressed by Robert Frost in these poems, right? So, as we said that there is an internal dialogue. Now, you see, whenever, what do we mean by internal dialogue? You see, internal dialogue has always had a very important significance in literature. You see that even Virginia Woolf, kind of uses this writing technique. James Joyce has extensively used this writing technique, what we also call as the stream of consciousness. But of course, Robert Frost cannot be associated with stream of consciousness, but definitely some kind of an internal dialogue. Now, what is common to all these references, or one can say this writing style in literature, is that it raises important questions, important philosophical questions, because all that we see in an internal dialogue are, one would say, the thoughts or ruminations of an individual. And when you get into the mind of somebody, get inside the mind of an individual, the kind of questions, the kind of preoccupations that go on over there become clear, and we understand that how the individual at different points of time is raising some important questions. Questions about life, questions about existence, questions about the values that drive humanity, and all these, right? So that's why we say that, internal dialogue, therefore, becomes an important literary device to I would say, explore the philosophical aspect of humanity, right? So Robert Frost then does exactly this in the poem The Boundless Moment. Now let us very quickly go over the poem. Now it's a 3-stanza poem. Let us take a look at it. Let us read all the lines, and then thereafter we will do a stanza-wise analysis and try to understand what exactly is it that Robert Frost is doing here. So on your screens next, you will see the poem by Robert Frost that is called A Boundless Moment. He halted in the wind, and what was that? Far in the maples, pale, but not a ghost. He stood there, bringing March against his thought, and yet too ready to believe the most. Oh, that's the paradise in bloom, I said. And truly it was fair enough for flowers, had we but in us to assume in March such white luxuriance of May for ours. We stood a moment so in a strange world, myself as one his own pretense deceives, and then I said the truth, and we moved on. A young beech clinging to its last year's leaves. And with this, the poem comes to an end. Now you see, you would have noticed in the poem, there's a very clear reference to a you, I. There's a kind of a conversation going on between the two travelers that we notice in the poem, right? You can see that they are constantly thinking, taking a guess, wondering what is it that they see in the distance, right? So that broadly is what the boundless moment does. Now in the next part of the lecture, we will look at each stanza and do a stanza-wise analysis of this poem. But if we very quickly do a recap of the points that we've raised in this segment, the first thing that we said was that Robert Frost is a seminal 20th century American poet. who was born in California, San Francisco, and he then moves to New Hampshire eventually in his life. The second thing that we said was that he spent a considerable amount of time in the countryside and also at times alternated between the urban setting and the rural setting as well. And this then tells us that how nature becomes an important presence in all of his poems. A third thing that we said was that he's also called as a New England poet because, he spent a lot of time in New Hampshire. Thereafter, we discussed, how Robert Frost's Robert Frost has been a very, very prolific poet who has written various poetry collections starting from 1913 and up until the middle of the 20th century. But the poem which is in discussion today is, or was composed in 1923, and we discussed that how that is very close at heels with a significant world event, that is the World War, and how that could possibly have had an impact on Frost's psyche and therefore ultimately on the poem that he composes. And the last point that we made was about the poem, broadly speaking, that the poem has at its center two travelers who happen to pass through forest, and they are met with a mysterious vision up ahead of them. They are unable to make sense of it. The second thing that we said about this poem, very importantly, was that in the poem, Robert Frost uses nature or deploys nature to also think about certain philosophical aspects of human life. So, references to nature and philosophical aspects then can be said to coalesce in this particular poem of his. Now, when we move on to the next lecture or the next segment of the lecture, we will look at the three stanzas closely and understand what are the points being raised by the poet there. Thank you.